King Ludwig of Bavaria is known as one of the strangest historical figures of all time. The mystery of his sudden death has never been solved, but historians have uncovered evidence that points to a chilling truth. As the eldest son of Maximilian II and Mary of Prussia, Ludwig II entered the world in dazzling royalty and luxury, and his father never let him forget it. From the moment he was born in 1845, the pressures of duty began to stalk him. There was a chilling duality in his life. Despite the pampering and the indulgence, a cloud of expectation hung over him, and it molded his personality in the most unsettling way. With his royal destiny sprawling out before him, young Ludwig rigorously prepared for his future duties. His tutors ruled him with an iron fist, laying down the law with an intense study and exercise program. The making of a prince was no easy task, but as he grew into a man, it became increasingly clear that he was a little bit odd. Simply put, his future reign was already doomed. He wasn't cut out to be a king. At his core, he was a lover of the arts and architecture, and his childhood served as the calm before the storm. He passed many joyous days at a fantasy-like castle that his father had built, losing himself in this real-life fairy tale. Ludwig became an avid daydreamer and lived an oblivious life. In 1863, he was assigned an orderly officer named Prince Paul, and the resulting intimacy changed his life forever. That autumn, the two adolescents spent 3 unforgettable weeks together. They went horseback riding, recited poetry for one another, and above all, shared a deep love for the composer Richard Wagner. It was the beginning of Ludwig's most impassioned relationship, but like everything else in the prince's life, it would only end in an unspeakable heartbreak. A year after meeting Prince Paul, Ludwig's charmed life as a young prince came to a brutal halt. His father had come down with an unexpected illness, and after 3 days of anxiety and worry, the king tragically passed. Suddenly, all the pressure that had been held over the young prince's head came crashing down around him. At only 19 years of age, he ascended to the throne, and sadly, he was not ready, and it definitely showed. When he became king, his closest comrade, Prince Paul, was far more than just a good friend. During this chapter of his life, the king kept a diary in which he expressed his true feelings for other men. These entries, along with a number of private letters, pointed to one jarring truth. King Ludwig II was gay. Since childhood, his friendship with Paul had grown into a deep love. Throughout his life, the king had a difficult time reconciling his romantic desires and his Catholic faith. Out of shame and necessity, the king suppressed his true feelings as best he could. As a king, he had a responsibility to eventually marry and produce an heir, and his longtime affair with his childhood friend came to an end in 1866, after Paul himself found a wife of his own. But as we'll see, Ludwig never truly escaped his darkest truth. Although he was now a king, Ludwig was not the imposing force his father might have wished him to be. He despised large functions and tried to avoid social events at all costs. He was shy and creative and preferred to spend time alone. Soon, his government ministers cast a suspicious eye over him. After all, what kind of king avoided his responsibilities? Although his personality sparked tension among his peers, he managed to win the hearts of his people. You see, Ludwig had the face of a prince. He was young and astonishingly handsome, with his pictures boasting a brooding gaze, an immaculate hairstyle, and a strong presence. However, his looks weren't the only reason for the population's glowing approval. In the eyes of the people, the introverted king made up for his deficiencies by connecting with them one-on-one. With his love for travel, he explored his own country and got to know his people along the way. He'd even stopped to have conversations with farmers and laborers. But that wasn't the most shocking part. To those that offered him their generous hospitality, the king bestowed luxurious gifts. Because of these delightful interactions, he was exactly the royal his people wanted. But this was only the beginning. To truly secure his name, he had to complete one important task, and that task was to produce an heir. During his early reign, Ludwig felt the weight of expectation grow heavy. He needed to produce an heir, and although the king was secretly gay, he had no choice but to marry. And this particular hurdle became all the more pressing in 1867. With his arm twisted, Ludwig became engaged to his cousin, Duchess Sophie of Bavaria. But this was no happily ever after. Ludwig and Sophie bonded over one thing, and one thing only, their love for the composer Richard Wagner. Only days before their engagement, the king had written to her, saying, quote, "The main substance of our relationship has always been Richard Wagner's remarkable and deeply moving destiny. Quote, but was this enough to sustain a marriage? Absolutely not. Clearly, the king didn't have his heart in the game. He kept flip-flopping on his fiancée, postponing their wedding date over and over again. Finally, in October 1967, he called it off entirely. He felt like the whole affair had been thrust onto him, and he explained to Sophie that he only viewed her like a sister. Of course, that wasn't the only reason for his hesitancy. Just when he was on the verge of tying the knot, he met a man that changed everything. In the summer of that year, the king fell head over heels for another man, a groom named Richard that worked in his stable. Unfortunately, the king took it a step too far, because when Richard began acting as a middleman between the king and his ministers, it unleashed lurid gossip and backlash. No doubt it was his romance with Richard that led to the end of his engagement with Sophie. However, when it came to forbidden romances, the king was just getting started. Ludwig spoiled his lovers with expensive presents and luxurious experiences. He even invited one on a royal vacation to Switzerland. His generosity knew no bounds. Unfortunately, goodwill and the love of beautiful things couldn't save the king from veering down a very dangerous path. Only 2 years after becoming king, he watched in dismay as Austria lost its independence, falling to Prussia during the Austro-Prussian War. But the fighting wasn't over yet. By 1870, the country had become part of the German Empire. However, as the king was never enthused by matters of the state, Ludwig's mind was more concerned with his passion projects. You see, when Ludwig visited France in 1867, he was awestruck. The country boasted the most gorgeous architecture, and he began to envision the castles and chateaus he could build in his own country. He wanted to beautify the land as France had. It wasn't going to be easy, but the ambitious king was more than willing to make a great sacrifice to achieve his goals. Desperate to see Bavaria studded with fairy tale castles, the king dipped into his personal fortune to fund his projects. Ludwig felt fulfilled as his dreams slowly turned to realities. Today, the new Swanstone Castle and the Linderhof Palace are magnificent examples of King Ludwig II's legacy, but sadly, his passions lay the groundwork for his tragic fall from grace. By 1885, the king found himself in a dire situation. He was 14 million marks in debt. He'd been wildly irresponsible by borrowing extravagant sums from his own family. He sought out loans from European royals while simultaneously turning the cold shoulder to his stately responsibilities. His ministers were scandalized by this behavior, but their criticism only deepened Ludwig's annoyance with them. So, tired of the cabinet's criticism, he considered replacing all the ministers with brand new faces. This horrified the cabinet, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. First and foremost, they had to depose Ludwig, but it had to be constitutional. They came up with the perfect solution, but it was unbelievably shady. Determined to overtake their king, the ministers decided to depose Ludwig by claiming that he was mentally ill. On the grounds of full-blown insanity, the king would be unable to rule, but they couldn't act right away. The ministers still needed proof, and unfortunately for Ludwig, they had an underhanded plan to get their hands on some very incriminating evidence. One minister set their nefarious plan in motion. From January to March in 1886, they began putting together a report that detailed Ludwig's insanity. They focused on the most vulnerable people in the king's castle, his servants, and the minister, using his intimidating rank, bribed the servants to reveal Ludwig's darkest secrets. The servants confessed to witnessing Ludwig's bizarre quirks and odd behaviors, his severe shyness, his opulent indulgence, and his apathy toward matters of the state. The servants also claimed that their king was aggressive and threatened their well-being. So, armed with a report filled with fragile accusations, the conspirators brought their case to the Chancellor of the German Empire. And he immediately sniffed out a rat. He doubted the report's accuracy and called it, quote, rakings from the king's wastepaper basket and cupboards, quote. The Chancellor suspected that the ministers just wanted to save themselves, but didn't do anything to disrupt their treacherous plan. The Chancellor's disapproval did nothing to change the conspirators' minds. In fact, they took it a step further. They sought the help of 4 psychiatrists who put their stamp of approval on the report. This was perhaps the most traitorous move of all. All of these psychiatrists claimed that King Ludwig suffered from paranoia, but this was a blatant lie. You see, all of these doctors, except for one, had never actually met the king, and they certainly hadn't examined him properly enough to confidently diagnose paranoia. This was a controversy in the making, and it didn't bode well for Ludwig. On June 10th, 1886, a commission arrived at the king's doorstep, and they were the bearers of the worst possible news. Now, although the commissioners had arrived with a deposition in hand, a loyal servant had tipped off King Ludwig hours in advance. This gave the king time to prepare. He ordered the authorities to guard him and to turn the unwanted visitors away. That very same day, the government had named a new Prince of Bavaria. As the brutal reality finally started to set in, the king listened as all of his allies pleaded with him to either flee or present himself in Munich. Instead, he made the wrong choice, opting to make a brash statement about planned treason and false allegations. And this was the nail in the coffin. King Ludwig flailed in open water. Nobody believed the authenticity of his statement, and with his disappointing show of leadership, his supporters began to trickle off. To make matters worse, the police that had been called in to protect him were replaced by 36 new officers who sealed off the entrances to the castle. Ludwig was trapped, but this was only the beginning of the nightmare. By the time Ludwig decided to throw in the towel and run, he had waited too long. On June 12th, a second commission seized him in the early morning. By 4 a.m., he sat in a waiting carriage, finally captive. Distressed by this turn of events, King Ludwig asked one of the psychiatrists, quote, "How can you declare me insane? After all, you have never seen or examined me before," and the doctor's response shook him to the core. The psychiatrist explained that he had no need to examine the king, as the evidence against him was already, quote, "overwhelming," quote. So the king was transported to Berg Castle, but his stay there would be tragically cut short. You see, fate had another cruel twist in store for the failed king. The very next day, he and the same psychiatrist decided to take a walk along the shore of Lake Starnberg, and that was the last time anyone saw them alive. They began their walk at 6:30 p.m. and were expected back by 8 p.m., but they never arrived, so a search party spent hours scouring the grounds in the pouring rain. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., they made the most disturbing discovery. Both Ludwig and the doctor were found propped up in the shore's shallow water. It was a ghastly scene. Now, although both of these men had their head and shoulders above the water, they were both deceased. It was a mystery right from the get-go. At first, all signs pointed to self-inflicted drowning, but the autopsy report made some shocking conclusions. First of all, there hadn't been any water in Ludwig's lungs. As for his psychiatrist, however, his body showed signs of severe blows to the head and neck. It even looked as though he could have been strangled. Something had gone seriously wrong during this seemingly innocent stroll. Some started to speculate that Ludwig had tried to escape from Berg Castle that day, and that his enemies had sabotaged his plans. But what had really happened? Shockingly, the king's personal fisherman held a missing piece of the puzzle. Ludwig's fisherman confessed, quote, 3 years after the king's death, I was made to swear an oath that I would never say certain things. Not to my wife, not on my deathbed, and not to any priest. Quote, he kept his promise to the state and never spoke of the truth, but after his passing, he did leave behind some telltale notes. These notes provided insight into what actually happened to King Ludwig on the day of his sudden demise. His notes illustrated King Ludwig's escape plan from Berg. The king had enlisted his help, who was to row him out to the lake, where a group of loyal supporters waited for him. The plan took a horrifying turn the second that Ludwig made contact with his fishermen. Quote, as the king stepped up to his boat and put one foot into it, a shot rang out from the bank, apparently killing him on the spot, for the king fell across the bow of the boat. Quote, however, there was only one glaring problem with this series of events. King Ludwig's autopsy did not report any wounds on his body. Down the road, Countess Josephine presented a familiar-looking gray coat to her guests during an afternoon tea. She claimed that the coat belonged to King Ludwig himself. Turning it over in her hands, she pointed directly to 2 holes in the back of the coat. To the Countess, it was all the evidence she needed. In her eyes, King Ludwig II had been murdered. Now, what was most interesting to you about this story? Was it the king's romantic endeavors, his passion for the arts, or the mystery of his death? Let us know down in the comments below, and if you're interested in more historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to the Fact In It YouTube channel.